So today we're joined by Professor Malcolm Purinton, who teaches history at Northeastern University, and he specializes in primarily in beer. So thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And let's start talking about you. How did you get involved in this field? Why beer? And what led you to it?
Well, it was totally by accident. I wasn't really planning on having a career looking at beer and beer history. But I mean, when I started, right after college, I started brewing my own beer at home. Really enjoying it and just kind of geeking out on the history of it and just kind of the different styles and where they come from and all just as a hobby, really. And after a bit, I realized I wanted to really focus on the study of history, but it actually wasn't even about beer. I was looking at kind of world history, but the history of religion and beliefs. And that's actually what I started my graduate school studies in, looking at just that type of history, learning Arabic and just looking at that. But I started going to festivals for beer, continued to brew my own beer. Sharing that beer at parties and with friends, and they all seemed to really like it. But I didn't really want to be a brewer. People kept asking me to start my own brewery, but the thing with brewing beer is I liked enjoying making small 5-gallon batches and having variety. But if you have your own brewery, you have to keep making the same beer over and over. And the whole goal is consistency and not always variety. So I didn't really want to become a chemist or a biologist or just, a keg washer. So I just kept researching and just learning about a bunch of stuff, just for myself, actually. And eventually I was at a festival and ran into a publisher of a local beer journal. And he asked me, learning that I was getting my master's in history at the time, like, hey, could you write something about history and beer? And I was like, yeah, sure, that sounds like fun. And so I wrote a short little article, started writing little pieces for this little magazine called Yankee Brew News. And then a professor overheard that's what I was doing and suggested I write my big kind of literature review for a class on African colonialism, about beer and alcohol in Africa. And I think my jaw just dropped. I was like, wait, I can do that? You mean I could just write academically about beer? That's absolutely crazy.
How difficult is it to brew your own beer? What is the process, and how is it different from big brewers who?
The process is pretty much the same. I mean, about the same as anyone brewing beer over the past, 1,000 years since people started using hops. It's nice. I mean, it's a simple, small type of thing. I mean, you still get the grains, and then you I was just doing this on my stove, so you get some grains that are already you go to a home brew supply store and get whatever type of grain, like malted grain that you want, whatever type of hops you want, whatever type of hops and different other ingredients, and then just kind of make a mash of using all of that grain that's already kind of ground up from the shop and soak it for a while, and you can basically get a whole bunch of sugar water off of that, and then you can kind of put that into a nice big cauldron practically, and heat it up. Once you do that, get it nice and boiling for a bit, then you just add some hops, let it boil for about an hour. Add hops at different points if you want to. Sometimes I'd add some honey or some candy sugar, things like that. Then you just kind of cool it off, throw some yeast in there, hope the magic begins. Then about a week, you get some beer. And then hopefully it's, tastes okay.
Do you make any particular type of beer, like lager or ale, or do you do
ales.
everything?
I do all ales. Honestly, having the temperature control to make a lager is very difficult. I would need a whole other level of control. So my beers were consistent enough. I would make the same beer a couple times because I just really liked it. It always tastes a little bit different each time because I didn't have all the special technology and things going through. So lagers would be much harder. I mean, that's why I wrote my book actually on the history of the Pilsner. And yeah, I do not have the skill to make a really good Pilsner. So I would make, I would just kind of mess around with different ale styles. I take like a Scotch ale, but then like add some smoked malt in there, and maybe some different types of hops, and kind of just mess around. Like just have something that's kind of smoky, kind of sweet, maybe a little bit bitter, and just kind of just see what came to my mind and be creative with it. It was fun.
And like, what's the difference between lager and ale, and then like when you go into ale, there is porter, and like, what's the difference between them? And like, for simple humans, not beer specialists.
Well, the big thing is the yeast. So yeast is one of the coolest little organisms on this planet. Honestly, yeast is awesome. It's basically just like a small single-celled organism, and it can divide all types of beer into ale or lager based on the type of yeast that's being used. Now, the yeast is what basically converts all of the sugar that's coming from like the cereal grains, from the malt, from whatever type of sugar you put in there. Basically, that yeast is going to eat that sugar up and then excrete carbon dioxide and, well, the fun of the beer, the ethyl alcohol, into the beer. And it's kind of incredible. I mean, basically, what this creature has developed is this way of, well, it can reproduce sexually and asexually. It is aerobic, so it can breathe oxygen and stuff, but it's also anaerobic, so it can do all of this like without any oxygen around. So if you have like, say, wild yeast, basically diving into like an old peach on a tree or something, and starts like going after that sugar, basically there's lots of other bacteria, lots of other types of things like microorganisms that want that sugar too. And that yeast basically creates this environment where pretty much it's the only thing that can survive, because it's an environment that has alcohol and no oxygen. And so the yeast is just so cool. So with beer, you've got the ale yeast, and that ferments at like a higher temperature. So around like 70, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And, it'll ferment at the top of the fermentation vessel and take about 1 week or so for a fermentation of, well, however much beer you have, however wort that's converting into beer. Nice quick turnaround, pretty easy. Though you do have to worry about sanitization. It's a big thing. No matter what you're doing, whichever type of beer you're making, the key to a good homebrew, or any type of beer, is just good sanitization and patience. Definitely. So the ale is pretty good. It's cheaper, it's faster, good turnaround. Lager yeast, on the other hand, while the history of the actual yeast goes back quite some time, the actual act of brewing lager doesn't become popular till the late 18th, early 19th century. Now, lager yeast ferments at the bottom of the fermentation vessel, which is nice, because if there's a bunch of stuff floating up on top, then it's not going to mess with the yeast, not going to mess with the fermentation. It's good stuff. But it ferments at a colder temperature, so you need to have much better temperature control. So it's going to be around like 50, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's going to be much slower at that colder temperature. So instead of 1 week like the ale, it'll probably take about 3 weeks for an initial fermentation to go through. And then you have another step. So lager means to store in German. And so basically that beer would then be lagered or stored in ice caves or just like cold space at freezing for 3 to 6 months until it was ready to be sold. So as an actual beer to make, much harder. You need a lot more space, you need a lot more capital, just a lot more time. And so it's pretty wild that the light golden lagers are like the global styles of beer over ale. So it's just kind of amazing.
And isn't it like way tastier? Well, for me personally, like I prefer lager a lot to ales and other type of beer.
There are so many varieties of beer. Lagers it's just a taste preference. There are a lot of breweries now that actually are making like India Pale lagers. So it's just about like that process of like what type of technology you have set up in your brewery, how much time you have. But the light golden lager, it's what's nice about it is lots of different things. Actually, I got a whole chapter just on taste in the book, and it's basically it's lower in alcohol. It has usually some bitterness, but not too much bitterness, and it tends to be very bubbly. A lot more carbonation kind of going in, so it can be very refreshing. You can also, this is something like a lot of like British writers and travelers were writing about in the 19th century. They'd be visiting like Austria and Germany and all these places, and coming back being like, wow, I could have like liters of this beer and could still walk. But if I have one strong beer in England, I'm done for the night. So you can have like the lagers can be something you can also at that lower alcohol just enjoy for longer periods of time. So, but some people, I kind of, you got like the IPA lovers of like craft beer and stuff, and I kind of like to call them like the hazy boys, like BOYS, because they're just like, they're just all about the IPAs. And it's like, that term doesn't even mean anything anymore. Like all these different like IPAs is just kind of like, you're going to tag an IPA name onto anything because it'll sell better for these people.
And which one are you?
Oh man, it kind of depends on the time of day, depends on the season, depends on the mood. I'm pretty much open to any type of style for the most part. Like, give me a good mouth-watering sour, give me like a strong barrel-aged, like, bourbon-tasting massive stout, or honestly, give me a good, like, nice Pilsner Cal or something, and just enjoy. Oh, honestly, like September though, September I will only pretty much be drinking Fest beers and Märzens. I'll have like the local made ones, but I'll be going for my Spatenfest beer, and I'll be going for like all my like German Bavarian styles. So it just kind of depends.
And you mentioned like Indian Pale Ale. Indian Pale Lager. What's the difference between IPA and that?
And IPA. Oh, honestly, just the type of yeast. They'll taste exactly the same. But, it can be marketed as something more fun and new, even if you couldn't really do a taste test that's very different between the two.
Is making it difficult as making lager beer, or is it simpler as pale?
It's about the same, actually. You would still have to have the lagering process, but you're just going to be adding more, different types of hops and keeping a higher alcohol percentage going for the India Pale Lager. So there's not too much difference than like just making a regular lager, just adding some more ingredients.
And what do you think about this age restriction in the United States about beer and about alcohol in general? Because like in Europe, in Germany it's 16, in Georgia where I'm at it's 18. And actually a funny story is when I was 18 I went to a boot camp with my friend to San Francisco, and there was a World Cup of football or soccer to your part of the world. Yeah. And so like we grabbed a couple of bottles of beer and started watching it, and the whole thing broke down. Like the TA, he reported us, and we had to write a letter to our parents that we made this terrible mistake of drinking beer while watching football, and we had to apologize to people who saw us drinking beer because they had to experience this. So what's with all this nonsense?
It's honestly, it's actually pretty recent. It's only about 40 years old that changed from like 18 to 21 during the Reagan presidency. Very specific moment in time that it continues on. Honestly, I find it to be pretty overall unhealthy because it kind of leads to a lack of respect for alcohol. Because it basically means that drinking alcohol for younger people in the United States, it becomes something that's an act of rebellion, something that can lead to really risky like behavior because it's that rebellion. It's like, oh, I've got alcohol, I need to drink it quickly and like do whatever I can do with it, but that's not the enjoyment of having a good beer or a glass of wine or a cocktail. It's like you can have the social lubrication, the fun of kind of talking, getting to know people, but that type of like act of rebellion, risk aspect, it just makes it more dangerous, and just lack of respect for yourself as well as lack of respect for the substance of alcohol.
Yeah, and
So,
once they're allowed to drink in colleges, like you should see the dorms, they get sick constantly. They don't know how to drink, how much they can drink.
oh yeah, it's just messy, absolutely, like a complete mess.
At least like making an exception for beer and wine. I think it
Yeah.
will be more productive for the country in general.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, these are debates that have been going on for hundreds of years. I mean, like if you're in England, if you're in Germany, all over the place, like discussion of like what is alcohol, like what who should be drinking it, when should they be drinking it? Yeah, God, and it's only like 40 years in the United States. If you can vote, you can't have a beer, and so it's kind of doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, so Georgia is an old country, and it's so history tells us that we were the first ones who uh, started working on wine, and so it's like basically wine was invented here, and we have this clay pots that we use to make wine, and it's been dated to like 6,000 BCE, so for a very long time. So what's the case about beer? What's the story behind it? When did it start?
So before 2019, I would have told you it was like 8 to 10,000 years old. But they found some research of some like intentional grain fermentation in some caves in like kind of like northwest Israel in 2019 that has been dated to about 13,000 years ago. So we're talking like before writing, before like before the wheel. So beer goes back a very, very long time. And some archaeologists have also been kind of arguing that beer was really kind of the reason for the beginning of humans settling down and like starting like agriculture and things like that. Which honestly, I find that to be very compelling. If we look at like, just Mesopotamia, the whole Fertile Crescent area, or, all the river valley, like Indus River Valley and other areas, there aren't that many, if you look at kind of like the history of religion, actually, there aren't that many like gods, goddesses devoted to, bread. And so if you're settling down, you're going to be producing grain, but what's that grain going to be for? There are countless different like deities that are devoted to beer, alcohol, fermentation. Like in ancient Sumeria, you've got Ninkasi. You've got stories like that abound in like ancient Egypt, where they had like 36 varieties of beer. So I think looking at kind of like a history of human society, human culture, it's like beer was really kind of the thing that we could strongly argue was the reason why humans settled down and started an agricultural civilizations.
And what was the process back then? How did they make beer? And how is it different from today's advanced technology?
Lots of praying. So, I mean, we didn't really understand like yeast and even like the life of yeast, life cycle, until Louis Pasteur published L'étude sur Bière in like 1876. So, while there was some knowledge of like this kind of mush, this stuff at the bottom of like the fermentation, could help with more fermentation. A lot of it had to do with kind of like a religious perception of this mystical way that we could turn this liquid into something that got us drunk. So basically that process would have been a lot more accidental. I mean, some of the ideas of how this was discovered would be like someone would, gathered some grains and just kind of like let it, wash them off and stuff, and kind of like, maybe left it in the water for too long, or left it in like a big, large, clay jar, and it got rained on, and so it started kind of started to like just kind of begin to germinate. So they're like, oh no, we don't want that. So maybe left it out in the sunshine, like on some rocks, on a roof or something, and then dried it out, and then maybe that got wet again. And then you could just kind of start putting that into water and maybe just start naturally fermenting. Because there's a lot of things that love sugar, and that fermentation could happen pretty easily. So, I mean, that's one idea. For the Egyptians, is actually the theory behind their production was actually that they would make bread, and then put the bread in, soak that in water, and then you'd have a fermentation coming from already like pre-made bread. So the process could be just grain straight to making the beer, or it could be make bread out of the grain and then use that to make beer. But the beer was also not just grain at the time. Like a lot of the evidence that we've found has actually been archaeological evidence, like kind of looking at the carbon, looking at all these different, like what were the ingredients. What we found is that they actually used to mix everything together. So the drinks that you would find, say, in like Anatolia, like present-day Turkey, like you'll find evidence that it was basically like beer mixed with wine, mixed with honey. So everything all kind of together in this alcoholic concoction that was naturally fermented. So, yeah, I mean, you have like wine, but you'd also have the beer, and then just whatever tasted good. Toss in some dates, some figs, toss in like whatever type of herbs or spices you feel like.
And so Mesopotamia is credited for like being one of the first beer producers, right?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and actually some of the earliest evidence for wine and beer, we can find the Zagros Mountains, which is basically the mountains on the western edge of Iran. Part of like just like the trade routes going like to and from kind of like ancient Persia to the Mediterranean and back.
And is there any type of beer or process of making a beer that has been lost to us that we don't use today, but was used, for example, in Middle Ages or before or after?
Well, yes, actually. While there are lots of recipes that have survived, including like the hymn Kasi in ancient Samaria. There's lots of different interpretations of what that cuneiform writing actually meant. But in the early Middle Ages, so let's look around like 10th, 12th centuries or so, before hops became a primary ingredient in the beer. So hops are what basically give the beer kind of some bitterness. They add flavor, they add aroma, they are a green flower that grows on a vine, and adds a lot to it, but also acts as a preservative, so it can last for much longer. Anywhere, instead of 3 to 5 days of beer that's not hopped, to something that could be going, weeks, months, years at a time. So prior to the use of hops, basically for making beer for sale, a lot of monks along like the pilgrimage routes across Europe, going through places like Cologne and stuff to Rome, all of these different these monks were setting up, not really taverns, but kind of like rest areas, places for people to spend the night, to be safe in their pilgrimage and so on. And in order to be able to produce beer for sale to all of these pilgrims, they would have to get a specific license from the Pope himself to be able to make a beer for sale. And these things were called Gruitrecht. Basically, it's like a Gruit license. Now, Gruit is what we refer to today as kind of like just unhopped beer. And they would put things, but these recipes were all unique. There's no clear, this is what Gruit is. I mean, a lot of times, we find it's probably like yarrow and kind of like sweet gale and rosemary, things to balance out the sweetness of like just the sugar water that becomes beer. But we don't have any clear recipe for defining what that actually was. They would just kind of put anything into beer. The first time that you have cloves in like Europe, it was tossed in the beer. Just kind of, hey, we've got all these cool spices coming from the Far East. Well, let's just put it in beer and see what happens first. So we don't really know what those recipes were, but once hops comes in, hops kind of become just quite dominant, for everybody brewing beer.
Mm-hmm. And your work centers around beer and how it was in British Empire and how Industrial Revolution facilitated the beer production. So can you talk about this? Can you explain to us what was the impact of the Industrial Revolution for beer?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Oh, it was such a game changer. At this point, we're looking at 1750, 18th century, right? Britain's the first, nation to start industrializing. Basically, using steam engines to first pump water and then like move looms and lots of things. Then move trains and so on. And coming out, this is like area of like the Enlightenment era after like scientific revolution. So coming out of the Renaissance and so on. So beer has been had already become a male-dominated job. So it had been women were the primary brewers, really like up until like the era of like Renaissance and Reformation. Like for literally thousands and thousands of years, women were the primary brewers. By the time you get to the Industrial Revolution, it becomes kind of like a male-dominated industry, and they start, figuring out ways to make the beer better. And by better, I mean more consistent. It's basically like consistency is king. That's like the real difficulty of making a good beer, especially one that you want for sale. I mean, if you're going to the store for a beer and you get the same beer each time you go, but it tastes different each time, are you really going to keep getting that beer? Probably not. You want something that you know is going to taste the way you expect it to. The Industrial Revolution helps with that because they start using this brand new thing called a thermometer. So they can figure out exactly what the temperature is. Like, what's the temperature when I'm like soaking that grain? And how long am I going to soak that grain? Or, a hydrometer, also known as a saccharometer, basically measuring the amount of sugar that's in like the pre-fermented beer, the wort, and then afterwards. So you can see like, oh, how much sugar has actually been lost? How does that equate to an alcohol percentage? And that means more consistency. Is this beer 3% or is it 10%? That's a really big change if you're drinking like a pint of it. So more consistency. And then you add in economies of scale, where now you have like breweries that are not just for a few people at a pub. It's now going to be for export. It's going to be like 10,000 gallon large casks full of beer. And you need a lot of knowledge, a lot of specific scientific knowledge and tools to be able to make that beer and make it good. That influence of Great Britain's industrialization of beer starts cascading over into Europe, continental Europe, in like the early 19th century, especially like the 1830s, 1840s, or so on. Now, also for England, like you have the very first industrial beer. You have, you don't really have clear names for beer until the Industrial Revolution, because you don't have clear marketing over long periods of time and over distance. And so the porter becomes like the first industrial beer. It's strong, it's black, it is usually quite bitter, which means you can kind of hide a lot of cheaper ingredients in there. So as a producer, you can, kind of mess around with it a little bit. If the hops are really cheap, you add more hops. If the grain is really cheap, you add more grain. It's not going to affect the flavor all too much. And so now you have a beer named after the men who would be carrying all of the porters who would carry all the stuff off the ships all around to like the shops in London. And
what makes it black?
Oh, that's actually the grain itself. You couldn't have a nice light golden color of a beer, or even a red style, or any type of like beer without the knowledge of how to get the grain dried quickly. So, stepping back to kind of like the process of making the beer, you have the grains, usually barley, but you can also use wheat, rye, sorghum, lots of different cereal grains, but barley being the main one. And you take that nice fresh grain and you soak it just a bit so it kind of like doesn't quite start to germinate, but it's that moment just before. So basically it's that moment of sugar, because it's basically developing sugar, so like from these different enzymes. So then you stop that germination. So basically it's kind of coated in sugar, like maltose. But the moment of drying that grain, and all of these different grains, to malt that beer, you want to dry it pretty quickly. So prior to having like nice warm air, like kind of steam power, you'd usually use fire. Fire is not very easy to control its heat, right? I mean, it's hot or it's not. And so those grains would end up, burnt, brown, like they would be very dark. And so that color equates to the color of what the beer is going to be. So the porter, using dark grains, before they figure out how to make a pale malt, all the beer is going to be dark. It's going to be brown, could be just black, all from those different types of grains that you use. And so another thing with the Industrial Revolution is that, hey, maybe we just use hot air, and now we can dry it rapidly using like powered fans instead of heating up over a big fire, or coal or something like that. So now you can have like a nice pale malt, which has a whole lot more sugar on it too, which means you could use less of that to create say like a 5% beer than you would like a dark brown beer with all those grains. And so that type of knowledge of how to make a nice pale malt is one of those things that leads to the ability to make a nice light golden lager later on. So all that's happening in England. Industrializing, large economies of scale so they can like make tons of that beer, sell it for much cheaper, transport it via ship, to the Americas, to India, to Australia, wherever all of the ships and the soldiers are all going. And then that influences continental Europe, where the beer was really bad. Like, it was pretty terrible. Like the best beer in the world, like absolutely, quantity and quality, was England, Scotland, UK, through really around like the 1850s. Because they're the ones who have the technological knowledge and the right equipment to be able to, make this beer. And so, actually, here's a little story. All right, so there are these guys. The way you get trained in London, in England, is it's a family business, and you're going to be learning from your father. You're going to be managing it. It's like, family-run, like firm, basically. Managing, the son's going to manage, taking over from the father, and so on. But in continental Europe, so we're looking like Bavaria, like the German lands, like the Austrian Empire, to become a brewer, it's still going to be a family business. But you have to apprentice around lots of different breweries. So basically, like, you have to travel all over the place, figure out what the best techniques are. Everyone's sharing their information, very collaborative. Like in England, like, they're using secret codes in their books. Like, they don't want the brewery next door to know what they're doing. So, like, they are very, very secretive. So these two guys, this guy, Anton Dreyer, he's coming from the Schwettkat Brewing Company just north of Vienna. He's going to take over his family's business. He's traveling around. It's like 1836 or so. And he meets up with this guy, Gabriel Sedelmeier Jr. He's going to take over the Spaten Brewing Company from his father, who has already started lagering beer there. So they're traveling around with one other guy. And they're like, we've learned a bunch of stuff from all these breweries, like in our lands. But the best beer in the world's in England. We should go there and learn from them. It's like, yeah, sweet. Field trip. Let's go. So they go to England. They travel to different breweries. They're like, wow, this is really cool. How do you do it? Like, what are these tools? Like, what are the different, like, all these like statistics you've got? And they're like, here's a sample if you want, but we're not going to tell you anything. So they're like, oh, okay, this is a bummer. How can we learn more about this? So what they do is they end up taking some pipe, and they cut it down, they paint it brown, and put a valve on the bottom. And as they're walking around these different breweries, they end up dipping that into all of these different vats, and then taking that back, testing it with the hydrometers, and testing it with like the new things that they just acquired in England. And, total corporate espionage. And they take that knowledge back with them to Bavaria and to Austria. So that's how basically like continental Europe gains all of this amazing knowledge, totally stealing it from the English. Yeah.
And how did they, like today, if you ask me, like what's the best beer, I'm gonna tell you it's German or Czech beer. Like, that's my go-to beer, and I think many people consider, like, especially Germany, to be like capital of beer, like Munich, and with all those beer fests and Oktoberfests. And so, how did they replace England? Like, if you ask me about England, like Guinness comes to mind, and that's it basically. I don't see England as a big wine, a big beer country. But Germany, how did they replace England in that?
It takes about 180 pages in the book. So A synopsis of that is basically it was a combination of lots of things. So you have the industrialization of like the lowlands, you know, like Netherlands. You've got Germany once it becomes a country in 1871. France, like they're all industrializing, in the mid 19th century, and so they can all kind of like even out that playing field for the the manufacturing, like the technological knowledge, and so on. But you have the collaboration aspect that England does not have. England is really focused on, like, those breweries are focused on their local market share, not really caring about the rest of the world. So they're really focusing on, like, basically developing this tied house system. So a brewery would basically buy as many taverns as possible and making sure those taverns can only sell that one brewery's beer. So it's all about, like a zero-sum game of however many taverns you have, those tied houses, equals how much profit you're going to have. Now, if you're in Germany, if you're in Austria, these different places, they were already like more export-oriented, in their approaches. One of those things with the industrialization is that they are also having railroads being put in. So railroads are crisscrossing England, they're starting to crisscross Europe. And so breweries, as they start making all of these lagers, they'll start making building those breweries right next to railroads. So, sweet, it's not going to be your local beer. It's going to be the beer that's going to get on the train that then could go to like Hamburg and then get on a ship and go anywhere. And so they're already making that beer. They're trying to make, working together too. Like Spaten is sharing its knowledge with Carlsberg. Carlsberg is sharing its knowledge with Heineken. They're all trying to make the best beer possible and working together on that. So they're making an amazing, consistent product every time, regardless of where you are in all of Eastern, Central Europe and Western Europe too. So all of those aspects come through, and it becomes like better beer, more consistent, export-oriented growth. So suddenly, British colonies like South Africa are going to be, wanting a lager, or Australia, or India. Japan's going to, when they start brewing beer, it's going to be a lager, German-style lager. They're going to start like importing German hops, German barley, Germans themselves to brew all the beer. So all of that kind of comes through that like export perspective. Like it's the era of, by the time we get to 1884, it's the era of European colonization all over the world. So all those colonies are going to start producing those German-style beers if you're a German colony, and it's going to affect all of the places around them. So like, Qingdao is started in Shanghai when it's a German colony. Japan's going to start producing its own German-style beers and exporting that beer to Australia, to India, to all these British colonies, gaining huge market share outside of the metropole of Great Britain itself.
And how about those Asian beers? So I tasted them. I really like Japanese beers and some of the other Asian beers. Is it a new phenomenon, or did they used to make beer for ages?
New phenomenon, especially if we talk about Japan. Japan was kind of historically very closed off to foreign influence. This happens in like the 1600s and ongoing throughout the 19th century. You have the gunboat diplomacy of Great Britain, but like that was more on the Chinese coast. In Japan, by the end of the 19th century, you basically have like one kind of port city that's devoted to international trade. That's where you have like the British, the French, the Americans, the Germans, everybody. Anyone who wants to do trade with Japan can only do it in this one place. Now, some of the higher ups in the Japanese government, they taste beer and they're like, it tastes like horse piss wine. This is not good. Like we're good with our sake. We do not need any of this stuff. But in these towns, you can't really, even though they're closed off, they're not going to, beer starts kind of leaking out into the population. And a number of the Japanese citizens start enjoying the taste of beer. So it comes to such a point where the government's like, okay, if we're going to start making beer, we will do this, but we're only going to do the best beer in the world. And we are going to decide and define what the best beer in the world is, and we think it is a light golden lager from Germany. So we are going to make we're going to follow like the German beer purity law of the Reinheitsgebot. We're going to make it with barley and hops and water and yeast, which actually isn't added until 1906, I think. Many, hundreds of years after the Reinheitsgebot begins in 1516. Anyway, I digress. So Japan is like, okay, we're going to have German beer. Like, Germans start getting accosted in the streets of Tokyo because they think anyone who speaks German must be a brewer and make good beer. So you have Asahi, you have Kirin, you have Sapporo, all these different like big breweries now starting at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, importing like really close relationship with Germans. You know, like everyone's going to get educated in the brewing schools of Germany. Germans are going to be brewing the beers, all of this, which works out pretty well. They become a very tight Japan and Germany, which throughout the 1930s works out pretty well. 1940s, not so much, because World War II is beginning. And after World War II, Germany, Japan both lose, and the Americans occupy Japan for 7 years after World War II. They're not very excited about the whole Germany-Japan relationship. So they're not going to allow Japan to be working at all with Germany anymore. So Japan has to develop its own industry, which means using local ingredients. Yes, they're still going to use barley, but they're going to have to grow their own or get it from the United States. What do they have? Rice. So now you're going to have an adjunct lager. That lager is going to be not following the German beer purity law. It's going to include more rice. It's going to have like a slightly sweeter flavor, maybe some corn, but it kind of develops its own like a real true Japanese local industry for beer production.
And like, is the beer we drink today, like Sapporo and Kirin and whatever, is it rice-based?
No, I mean, it's still barley-based for the most part, but some rice is being used in that production. I mean, it's actually quite similar to Budweiser, too, in the United States. Using corn, using rice, using basically the grains that are cheaper when you mix them together to make the beer. So reaching that, like, what's the best way to get the best, like, bottom line for your, big bang for your buck?
Budweiser is considered to be like the lowest of the lows of the beer. What do you think? Is it true? Is it that bad?
Honestly, not so much. It's kind of incredible, honestly, like how they were able to make such a consistent product at such a massive scale. That is just impressive. Budweiser itself, so like Anheuser-Busch, like they make Budweiser starting, I think it was like 1876, and they basically designed this beer to be as palatable as possible for as many people as possible. And then the aim being consistency. So there's already railroads going across the United States, but they wanted to start selling their beer not just in St. Louis, in like the Midwest of the U.S. They want to sell that beer in Mexico City, in New York City, and they want it to be the same product. So Budweiser becomes massively popular because it's a beer that you recognize, regardless of where you are in the whole North America, and one they can make tons of money at and sell all over the place. So it's a damn good beer. Really, really good beer. And a very powerful company. So if you look at the spread of, beer into British colonies, like British Honduras, present-day Belize, I actually went there to do research for my dissertation, where I was like, okay, what's the most unlikely place for a Pilsner to become popular? A British colony. Let's figure this out. So I'm like, all right, are there Germans here? No. Oh, it's Budweiser. Anheuser-Busch is coming down here and starts taking over the beer markets of Central and South America in mostly the early 20th century. So looking at that export-oriented growth, similar to what the Germans, continental Europeans had been doing for decades prior. So Budweiser, it's not my favorite. I don't buy it, but it's not the worst of the worst. That'd be like Natty Light or something like that. It's it's going to be consistent. You know exactly what you get, for better or worse.
And what's the best beer for you? Like simple best beer.
The beer that got me into beer, because like, again, my taste. I mean, it could be. It depends on if it's a breakfast beer. Is it lunch beer? Is it dinner beer? But the beer that got me into beer was Trappist ales. So Belgian style Abbey ales, and the Chimay Blue is always a favorite. Like when I graduate, when I like have a celebration, and it's gonna be like a celebration beer. While I enjoy celebration beer by Sierra Nevada every year, love that beer. The Chimay Blue is gonna be the one I'm gonna open up. You know, it's gonna be like the one I'm just gonna like get to like the right temperature and just kind of sip for like a long time, just enjoy all of the flavors coming from the yeast and the sugar and the aging and everything like that. And yeah, because those Belgian ales got me into like looking at beer differently, not as just something to taste, but something to be like, huh, monks make this. Why do monks make this? The history behind them kind of led me down this long liquid road I've been on.
And so in Georgia, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but we have filtered beer and unfiltered beer.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the term? Yeah, so...
Yes. So it's kind of like, I'm assuming the filtered is going to be very clear and the unfiltered is going to be slightly cloudy?
Correct.
So it's kind of interesting right now. About 20 years ago, unfiltered beer became rather popular in like craft beer in the United States, which was just kind of like a new kind of marketing thing. You know, they kind of, you know, they would partially filter it, you know, so you didn't have like, wouldn't be super cloudy or super hazy. Though now we've got this whole hazy IPA thing, where they actually, there's a lot of breweries that focus just on creating a beer that is so opaque, like you cannot see your fingers through it at all. And that's its own style, which it more looks like an orange juice smoothie or something like that. A lot of them will taste quite similar, like lots of citrus. So you don't really have the marketing in the US for filtered versus unfiltered anymore. It's more like, is it clear or is it hazy? And to be like the New England style IPA, that's kind of where they kind of go in that direction. Very hazy, opaque, generally very fruity. Yeah, they're quite good every once in a while.
And when you say filtered, what is filtered out? What is that that gives it this cloudy...
So basically, it's like a partial filter. So if you're looking at like, God, one of my favorites was this one Long Trail unfiltered IPA. They had the regular IPA and the unfiltered IPA, which I'm not really sure if there was all that much of a flavor difference between them, but it did seem to me that like the unfiltered was like, I don't know, it just seemed a bit more, I guess, authentic, because like my homebrew wasn't clear. Like it'd have to sit for a very long time, so like everything would have to like float down to the bottom. With the filtering that you do at an actual like, you know, professional brewery, I mean, it's running through like a bunch of things. Like during the fermentation, it's going to be in this really big like stainless steel conical tank. And once the fermentation is done, like they'll like spin the whole thing around, whirlpool, and that'll kind of like separate out, you know, like the hops, like the proteins, like all the spent yeast, like as much as possible from that now fermented beer. That's gonna be kind of step one. Then you can also like save that yeast, reuse it, things like that. That's if you know, wash it first. But then you're gonna run it through like lots of different like filtration, pieces, like almost like sponges, to take out as much as possible, to make it as clear as possible. Unless you want to do a hazy IPA or something that's, you know, less filtered. If it's less filtered, you can basically just make all those filtering holes just like a little bit bigger, a little bit like, you know, so you can get some of those proteins and other things in, so it'll be kind of still floating in the beer to give it that hazy look.
And we say it's more difficult to digest this unfiltered beer. And like if you want to go light and just don't overload yourself, just take a filtered beer. Is that true or is it just a perception?
I think it's more the perception, because like if it's, I mean, looking at specifically like a golden lagers, you know, you can have like a Pilsner, a Helles, or something like that. Or you can have a Keller beer, which is usually like it's like a cellar beer that is typically unfiltered. And it'll basically just still have some yeast may or may not be alive like in that. So you get some more proteins actually. You might get some more B vitamins coming from that. But I think that perception, if they're both the same alcohol percentage, you're not going to have very much of a difference in terms of like fullness. You're still that's going to be coming just from the volume of liquid that you're ingesting.
Another thing about perception is they say beer promotes female hormone growth of female hormones. You know, and is that true? Like it's becoming men having like this large breasts. Is it caused by the female hormones or just them getting fat from drinking too much beer and
it's
eating
more the
too
beer
much?
thing. So that was like, God, I can't believe that's still around. Yeah, no, I remember reading a lot about that years ago. Honestly, that was actually a phenomenon that was known. It wasn't so much about kind of like the growth of like breast tissue. It was actually, I think it was just called like brewer's dick. That's what it was. Because hops can have some God, what is the hormone called? Estrogen. Hops can have some like amount of estrogen in it, but so does soy. Not enough to like really affect. You have to have like a ton. But there was a phenomenon, I think like late 19th, early 20th century that was written about in some of the brewing industry journals called brewer's dick. It's basically just like you can't get hard. Which they would kind of like, but that's not something that's talked about at all anymore. I mean, you'd have to be like, just kind of like laying and kind of soaking yourself just in hop flowers to get like any level of estrogen to like have any type of effect like that on your actual hormonal system as a male or a female. It doesn't really matter, whatever you are. So like that's just bullshit. Yeah, I mean that was a phenomenon they used to write about, but especially today, like it's more about you're just taking in a lot of calories if all you're drinking is like strong beers. So that's definitely a lot more. I mean, you can work out. That's fine. Do a lot of push-ups. Firm it up.
That's what I was worried about.
It's the calories, man. It's the calories.
And in Georgia again, we have this tradition. Then every time you're hungover, you wake up before drinking water, before brushing your teeth, you go and you straight up chug a bottle of beer.
Ooh.
And it helps. Have you done it?
So I think like once or twice. Yeah, it's referred to here as the hair of the dog, which actually a brewery in Portland, Oregon, called itself the hair of the dog, and it's a damn good brewery. Yeah, no, it's what that does. It just puts off the hangover a little bit longer. I mean, that's not. It feels good for a little moment, but like, oh, you're gonna still feel like crap soon. That is just postponement for a little bit longer, and yeah, I highly recommend drinking just some water.
And another craziest thing we have is, if you want to drink heavily, it's called like in translation, it's like if you hang it. That's how it translates to English. And so you take a glass of beer, and you pour vodka in it. Or you drop a glass of vodka into it. Sometimes you use beer as a chaser, but the idea is still the same. You drink vodka and then you follow up with a beer.
Oh,
and every time you have it, if you put it into the beer, so every time you take a sip, then you add another shot. So you increase the percentage of vodka in a beer. And
wow.
It's a sure way to get blackout drunk. You don't remember anything.
Oh my God! Yeah, guaranteed. That sounds rough. Yeah, I mean, I've learned as I've studied more and also just kind of gotten older, I guess, I really appreciate like the flavors so much more now. So whether that's a whiskey or gin or something like that, I find I drink a lot slower, and I mean, it's the volume. If I'm gonna get drunk, but it's not gonna be my goal like it used to be when I was young. Where I'd be like, oh, I want to feel this level, and now I'm like, I could go without feeling that level. I'm gonna sit here and I'm enjoy a nice buzz. I'm gonna get like a little tipsy, but yeah, vodka's never been my drink of choice. I've definitely never dropped vodka into a beer that I was drinking. The beers I'm drinking, I'm usually like, I like the taste of this beer, and I don't need to dilute it with anything.
Especially with vodka.
Yeah, oh man.
So, is U.S. to go to more serious part of the discussion? Is U.S. Competitive? U.S. beer production competitive with the rest of the world? I mean, by the quality. Like, for me, it's not. Like, every U.S. beer that I've drunk, it's not as good as when you go to Germany or Belgium or like some European beers.
Those are specific styles. Honestly, I think the best beer in the world is the United States right now. The amount of variety that you have is wild. There's so much variety, and so you can go to. Honestly, just outside Boston, you have Notch Brewing Company, and Chris Loring, the head brewer there, an owner. His beers are perfect, like Eastern European styles. He's even been recreating like some like old ways of fermentation and barrel aging and different things like that. Like he's got it dialed in to make a delicious like Helles or Stark beer or Pilsner or Fest beer. Fantastic. And honestly, my own tastes have shifted to enjoying like, Austrian, Belgian, the Eastern European beers, like the Czech ones, Czech lagers, German lagers, and so on. And also Von Trapp Brewing Company up in Vermont, the state of Vermont. Delicious Eastern European beers. Like, completely dialed in. But a lot fresher than you could get from an import coming in from Germany, from Czech Republic, or so on. But also, one of the things that the United States beer, like craft beer, has done is lead to this kind of focus on craft in terms of like the craft of brewing, making the smaller batches, developing new flavors, new styles of beer, new ways of really experimenting. Because there hadn't really been all that much experimentation with beer for an extremely long time. The experimentation of beer of the 19th century, 18th century, most of the 20th century was about experimenting with making a more consistent article that will reach the largest amount of people as possible. Money, money, money. But with craft beer, it's been more about, how can I make something interesting that people might like? Maybe they won't like it. Maybe I like it, and just a few people do. Let's make something like that. And that's actually something I found to be interesting and you've seen this style, this craft beer revolution, if you want to call it that anymore. That's kind of been the big American export over the past 20 years for any type of food or drink, where you've got small breweries popping up in Italy, in South Africa, all over the world, really, where you're seeing what I like is kind of a beer terroir for breweries. Like, they're making their own, nationally or culturally based flavors for different types of beer. So that's both coming from great American experimentation, exporting that idea of what is authenticity of the local, of the national. And then you also have those that are creating and recreating those really specific styles, those old dialed-in ones of Bavaria and Bohemia and so on.
So for you today, number one beer country is United States.
Absolutely, hands down. You got the styles, you got the craft, you got the quality.
And how about Mexican and Latin American beer?
Well, that's a funny story too. I mean, it's good. I mean, Mexican beer. I think Modelo is like in the top three beers being consumed in the United States right now. Guinness is actually way up there too. So those have become extremely popular. I mean, Corona, Modelo, and so on. They're good. I mean, they're all based on German immigrant recipes from like from the middle of the 18th century. If I was doing a side by side between, I don't know, Corona and Coors, I probably wouldn't be able to tell too much of a difference. So, I mean, you got the corn added in, just like all the North American beers. But you also do have craft beer. I mean, go to Costa Rica, like you can taste some really good local styles of beer. Go down to South America, you can even find some places that are making chicha. So like basically beer that's made by like chewing up just corn and making like a fermented corn beer. So there's lots of kind of like, there's fun history that goes through. But again, I mean, I'm going to the store, I'm probably going to pick up a Belgian or like a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale.
Is Corona good beer? I was
It's
told
consistent.
by those who like act as their beer experts that it's not as good as some other beers. It's just like basically a piss in a bottle.
I mean, the Corona glass, I mean, the fact that it's like clear glass is kind of telling. Like the two things that are going to make your beer go bad are oxygen and sunlight. So that's why you have dark bottled beers, like dark brown beer bottles, because that allows much less sunlight in. Cans are much better because it doesn't allow any sunlight in. So a Corona beer is not something you want to keep around because it is going to go bad. It's going to be called light strike. That beer is not going to be lasting very long. So that could certainly lead to the impression of the beer from the beginning being bad. But, I mean, yeah, it's made for mass markets. People much prefer Modelo over Corona. But the market share, depending on if you're on a beach in, I don't know, Cancun, you're probably going to have a Corona. It's going to be, put a little lime in there, have your kind of little ritual of having a beer in Mexico. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily good. I wouldn't say it's the worst.
Does aging beer work? Is it a thing to age it like you age a wine bottle?
Absolutely. Depends on the beer, though. Because, like an IPA, hell no. Because basically, I mean, the flavor, everything like coming from an IPA is coming from the hops. Hops are a flower. That flower has been picked. That flower has been dried and put in your beer. So you get a lot of good, wonderful flavors and aromas coming from those flowers. But just like flowers that you pick and like put on your, dining room table, they're gonna die and they're not gonna smell as good pretty soon. So an IPA, you want that as fresh as possible. But a nice Belgian ale or any type of like real strong beer, where you're getting a lot of good like flavors and aromas from the yeast. So like Belgian Abbey Ale styles, for instance. That yeast is also going to be like bottle conditioned, hopefully. So there's going to be yeast in those bottles. So that means that yeast is going to slowly transform the flavor profile of that beer over time. So, I mean, I probably wouldn't cellar it for more than like 5 years. But I've definitely like doing a vertical tasting of the same beer for multiple different years can be a lot of fun. You can just see how the yeast like transforms that beer over time. But again, very specific styles of beer to want to do that.
And is there a higher end beer market? Like, and how expensive does it go? What's the pinnacle of beer?
Oh man, I've got. So I also write for a beer journal, so like I get beer sent to me sometimes. So on the higher end are the high alcohol experimental beers. Like when I was doing research in London, I stopped by Brewdog, and they had just put in like Camden Town, Scottish brewing company. They had just put out their, I think it was the Nuclear Tactical Penguin, which was like I want to say it was like a 40% beer. And I think I paid £5 for like a shot just to taste that. just a taste. Samuel Adams Brewing Company. You know, office is based in Boston, but breweries in Cleveland and Western Pennsylvania. They have their Utopias, which I've got a couple here from over the years. They make it every 2 years. That's a $250 bottle, and that's because it's a blend, usually of like upwards of 10 to 15 years of different beers, to a very specific flavor profile for that iteration of the Utopias. And it's also naturally fermented. Going to be, all that beer is naturally fermented, and it's about like a 28% beer. Unlike the BrewDog ones, which basically they just kind of like slowly lowered the temperature until ice started forming and just took the ice off. So that way you're just kind of like removing water from that beer to make it stronger. So it's usually those that are super high end. Usually a bottle, a good like, I don't know, 350 milliliter bottle of like a good Belgian could run you, upwards of like $20, $30. But, no different than like a bottle of wine.
Mm-hmm. And so alcohol concentration in a whiskey, for example, the more premium it is, the higher the concentration, higher the alcohol percentage in it. Is it the same thing for beer? Does alcohol matter?
Not as much. It's more about the style on that one. And for like whiskeys, the beer, those things can run very, very hot, and then they're always going to be like diluting them down. They're always, whiskeys are going to be like blended most of the time. So the strength is more about also a choice. In the United States, it's like in bond, so it's going to be like 100 proof, very specific. A lot of them are going to be around like, in the low 40s. People are just going for like specific flavor profiles. Like things that have been aged for longer are going to cost more. So it's more about the longer age for those types of alcohol. With beer, it's going to cost more if it's a higher alcohol beer, because the higher alcohol percentage means that a lot more ingredients were used in that beer. So it's going to cost a lot more to make a 10% Scotch ale, and especially one that's going to be like aged in like old bourbon barrels or something like that. That's going to cost a lot more to make, which means the beer itself is going to cost a lot more. So it's going to be that much more unique. So it's kind of the marketing of it, the process of production, and the decision on how to who's the consumer that they are aiming for. It's going to be someone with more money, someone who is more discerning in what they drink.
How much beer do you drink?
Not as much as I used to. Honestly, it doesn't. If I go out, I may have 3. Staying home, I'll have maybe 2. So I don't know. I probably have about 5 to 8 beers a week.
So a beer a day.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
And how does someone inexperienced get into this tasting of beer and not just using it as a means to getting drunk, but savoring the taste and enjoying the drink itself?
Actually, something that's a lot of fun to do. Get some friends together and pick a style of beer. So, say, buy like 5 different porters or 5 different pale ales, 5 different, whatever style. And then you can all get together and taste them. You could blind taste them to be cover up what they are, just pour them all out. So you have 5 different glasses in front of you. And then taste them. Which one do you like? What are the flavors that you can taste that's different from one to the next? Is there one that you really didn't like? And figure out exactly what is it that you enjoy the most? And that way, when you go to the store, you can be like, this is the porter that I like. What is it about this porter? I can find other ones that taste similar to that. Boom, now you're already an educated drinker. Do the same thing with different types of pale ales. Be like, what hops are in this IPA? Okay, I like this type of hop, not this type of hop. So I'm going to look for beers that are made in those types of styles with those types of ingredients. So, a lot of fun. Highly recommend just kind of getting some people together and just doing some tastings, seeing what you like, talking about those different types of beers. Very enjoyable activity.
I really like drinking Guinness, especially when I was in the United States. Like every time I went to the bar to watch some sports, NBA, mostly I order Guinness. And in Georgia, I found out that like there is Guinness, but it's not the same. So when I drink it, it's different. What gives that difference? And why is it hard to maintain that standard that's in the United States and in England?
Well, I mean, a lot of that's going to be like import-export, just like how old that beer is, where it's coming from, how long it's been traveling, like the freshness of it. There's also like, I mean, God, people write about, you know, like the best pour of a Guinness. You know, you have to like let it settle down and like, you know, the process, the ritual of pouring a Guinness to get there's just the right amount of like, you know, carbonated head on the top. In the United States, Guinness has been so popular that they have actually recently opened up a new brewery in Chicago. Guinness has. It's just wild. Nigeria, they have multiple breweries because they just love Guinness so much. So it's more about how far away you are from the source. So the ingredients are going to be the same. Like hopefully the brewers are excellent as they usually are, so you get the right, like the water's going to be at the right pH. The ingredients are all going to be the same. But it's more about like how far it's been traveling. Like Guinness actually, back at the turn of the 20th century, they hired up this guy named Arthur Shand to be a beer taster. Because Guinness wasn't even selling under its own name at that point in time. Basically, they would produce all the beer at James Gate, St. James Gate in Dublin, and then sell that beer to bottlers who would then sell the beer under their own labels all over the world. So Arthur Shand was hired by Guinness to be like, hey, we need you to travel all over the entire world over the next couple of years and taste Guinness everywhere. Figure out if there's inconsistencies. Are some of these bottlers not doing a good job? Like, is it a little bit loose? Does the beer end up flat coming out of that bottle? Like, what's going on? And he was able to, he went to Australia, he went to Los Angeles, he went to Cape Town, South Africa, he went across Europe, all over the place. His journals are really fun to read. They're actually at the Guinness archives I went to. And basically, soon thereafter, Guinness starts marketing under its own name in the 19-teens. So that was to make sure they had a better consistent article around the entire globe. Bottle their own beer, market it under their own name, make a lot more money, and start producing that really consistent quality product. Having it on tap, coming up with a whole nitrogenated beer instead of carbonated beer, that's why the bubbles fall instead of go up. All these types of things were like just big innovations done by the Guinness brewery. They've done a lot of really cool things. Like the whole p-value and statistics, that was from Guinness. Some really amazing stuff. So, basically with the Guinness, wherever you're going to get it, you want someone who knows how to pour it, and you want to really hope it's going to be as fresh as possible.
And when you buy Guinness in cans, there is always this round thing in it.
The widget.
Yeah, so what is it? How does it work?
So, it's because it's nitrogenated instead of carbonated. So, when most beer is not going to be naturally fermented. It's going to be naturally fermented, but it's not going to be naturally carbonated. So basically, all the yeast is going to be taken out, all the CO2 is going to be let out, and they're going to force carbonate that beer so that it can be just the right pressure level for that beer. Because the bubbles equal, preservative, because if you have more carbon dioxide, that's less chance for oxygen to make it go bad. But it's also going to be how bubbly is it going to feel? What's the feeling on your tongue? Nitrogen, well, it's heavier than air, so carbon dioxide goes up, nitrogen goes down, and it ends up with a really nice, smooth mouthfeel. That's the goal with, a good Guinness. And it's very difficult to recreate the draft taste, the draft feel from a can, let alone a bottle. So that widget, what it does is as you're, if you're going to be using that can, you want to, basically put your glass over the top of the can. Open it up, put the glass over the top, flip the whole thing over, and then slowly pull that can up. That way you can see all the bubbles falling. You can get that nice head right at the very, very top. I recommend doing this with about a 20-ounce glass just to make sure, even if it's a 16-ounce can. And that widget is basically disturbing all of the beer inside. And it's going to lead to that really good creamy head. Basically like kind of distributing that beer, just making it really turbulent so you can get like that nice mouthfeel of the poured Guinness that you've just had.
And how do you pour beer? So I have seen people tilt a glass and pour it so for probably carbon dioxide doesn't leave, and it's like this big of bubbles at the top of it. But on the other hand, some people say you need to let those bubbles come out, and it's more healthier to like pour it like crazy and have these bubbles come out and drink it that way. Which is the proper way of pouring a beer?
The proper way is that side pour. You don't the bubbles. You want the bubbles out. I mean, it's just a different type of beer. Like if you want something that's if you don't want super carbonated, then just get something that's not that. You can just let it sit for a while if you want to, but like, no, you want to end up with like basically like an inch, like a good like finger of head on the top. You want a good like nice layer of foam on the top of that beer. Goes for almost every beer, most beers. Because as you do like a nice like side pour, like make it very, very smooth pour so you get a little bit of a head as possible. And then as you get towards the top, straighten it out and then dump just a little bit so you get a nice little turbulent top where you have that good head. Because those bubbles are that's where all that aroma is going to come in. And so like that better like smell is going to enhance the flavor that you're going to get as you're sipping too.
But like they say it's unhealthy to drink very carbonated beer. Is it another thing of perceptions or?
Basically, I mean, like a very carbonated beer is just the carbonation is more about the mouthfeel and the aroma, like as you're smelling it. Like, but if you drink too much, yeah, you're gonna have to burp like crazy. I mean, that's just a lot of gas in your system and not as much beer. So, I mean, just drink a little bit slower and you'll be fine. That's pretty much my take on that.
Drinking beer too slow, for me at least, is not as pleasant as drinking it quickly, because if you let all those bubbles come out, like it doesn't retain that flavor that I like about beer.
I mean, drinking one beer over the course of like a half an hour to an hour, there's still going to be enough carbonation by the end.
To an hour? Hour is too much.
Depends on the beer. I mean, if it's a nice, refreshing, like not too carbonated beer, and it's just kind of like, I'm thinking like a good Pilsner, something you can just kind of quaff. But if I'm drinking like 8 to 10% strong, like dark Belgian beer, I'm going to sip on that one slowly for a good hour because there's not as much carbonation and a whole lot more flavor that's just filling up my mouth with each sip.
And what do you think about future of the beer industry? Do you believe in those non-alcoholic beers? Is that a thing or?
It's huge. Yeah, I mean, that's actually kind of been wild. I mean, the future is consolidation. The future is not like large breweries that are going to come out of nowhere. It's been happening with craft beer in the United States a lot. Just a lot of like breweries kind of coming together, consolidating, like all kind of like coming under one umbrella, like lots of brands coming under one umbrella brewery. NA beer, so non-alcoholic beer, is wildly popular. I mean, it's been popular in Scandinavia, like Scandinavian countries for a while. It's been popular in Europe for a while. It's huge in the United States. In the top, I think it's in the top 10 breweries in the whole country is Athletic Brewing Company, which makes non-alcoholic beer. That's all they make. And they started in Connecticut state, and now they just bought and have opened up a whole other brewery in San Diego, on the western coast. So like the popularity of that has been incredible to witness, and I'm not sure about like how long that's going to last. I think it'll still maintain a really strong market share, like Probably for the next like 5 years. But I can see a decline in the non-alcoholic beer sector going in after like 5 years or so. It's been a real shift of different flavors at different points. Like right now we have a whole generation of new younger drinkers that are not going for like the big, craft IPAs. Like my students get just like, why do people like IPAs? That's like, that's what my dad drinks. And it's like the pendulum is swinging away from those specific styles of beer back to younger drinkers drinking Modelo and drinking lager and drinking Guinness, which is what was, the people who were like came of age drinking wise in 2000 were very much against. Like, oh, that's what my dad drinks, so I'm going to go with this whole craft beer thing. So, I mean, what we're going to see over the next like 5 to 10 years is fewer breweries. We'll see what breweries do survive have to make very, very good beer and have to be very unique and have a very, not just good beer, but a good story. That's a big thing with like smaller breweries. You have to have a good narrative for your brewery, for your beer. Like you're selling not just something to drink, you're selling an idea. You're selling like an identity that goes along with that beer.
What's an example of a good story?
Oh, well, okay, brewery. Okay, perhaps not. A good story would be Sierra Nevada Brewing Company out of Chico, California. This is a legacy craft brewery, started in the early 1980s. One of the very first like independent breweries in the United States post Prohibition, basically. Ken Grossman was like, he was like a bike mechanic. He wanted to get into beer, home brewing, doing all these things, and basically starts like kind of MacGyvering, putting together like equipment on his own. Still family owned independent brewery, very consistent beer. Becomes the first to make like wet hot beer. That's their celebration winter beer, and that's like it's a legacy story that talks about the family, that talks about independent ingenuity and innovation, and the adoption of new types of hops, new types of flavor, introduction of new products for market. But going along with a long legacy, consistent product. Or we can look at this brewery, Night Shift, that actually just sold their brand to another Massachusetts brewery. But their story was really good. There's 3 guys, best friends. They were working full-time jobs, all living together in an apartment, like just around Boston. And in the evenings, they would brew beer. And they'd kind of mix up all these crazy recipes, and they'd be brewing beer like every night. So it was their Night Shift. Great name, great story. And they start kind of pull their stuff together and start the Night Shift Brewing Company with a great brand owl drawn up by one of the founders, Oxley, not Ox. And it's basically like, it looks like an owl, but the body is actually a hop flower. So, beautiful brand, great simple story of like independent home brewers, real natural, real authentic, and start a really great brand.
And you mentioned Prohibition. How did it impact the beer development in the United States?
Oh, I mean...
Another 100 pages from the book?
Oh, I mean, that's kind of like the next one. I mean, when I first started studying the history of beer and stuff like that, I'm like, I am not going to talk about Prohibition because I want to talk about people who do drink. So Prohibition was terrible for the brewing industry because you already had like a few very large breweries, but all like the smaller ones, the mid-level sized, for the most part, they all closed down and went out of business. The big ones that did survive were the ones that diversified. So like Coors, for instance, out in Colorado, they start making high-end glass, like scientific equipment, beakers and things like that. So they're able to survive that way. This brewery in Pennsylvania called Yuengling starts producing ice cream. Other breweries start producing like low alcohol beer, which doesn't sell very well because it doesn't taste very well, or like selling malt extract, things of that nature. Coming into, by 1933, actually, happy repeal day. Today, 1933 was the end of Prohibition. Happy repeal day, everyone. So when that is over, the only like lots of breweries start up, like tons of breweries open up. Everyone's like, "Sweet, yeah, we're gonna start making lots of beer. It's gonna be wonderful." Starting a new business in the middle of the Great Depression, not a good business decision. So the only ones that are able to survive through the Great Depression are the ones who had continued to survive by diversifying in the 1920s during Prohibition here in the United States. So that's when you have, like, once you get out of World War II, the Great Depression and everything, that's when you have just Anheuser-Busch, you've got Coors, you've got Pabst, Schlitz, all of those same breweries started by German immigrants back in the 19th century. And that's kind of how it was. Very few small independent breweries until we get to basically like the late 1970s and going into the 1980s.
And for the final question, what is a niche beer that you can recommend that is not popular, that people don't know about, but is a must?
Most people don't know about Cantillon from Belgium. Sour beers. Sour beers are a style that I initially appreciated not for their flavor. They're sour. They're really sour. They're funky. They are weird. And I initially only appreciated it because brewers will use like wild yeasts. And there's microorganisms floating all around us, right? So these wild yeasts will just kind of like go in and attack all that sugar. You don't know what that beer is going to taste like. It's going to be weird. It's going to be sour. It's going to be funky. And so one of the best places that does this is Cantillon. So Cantillon. Their beers are fantastic. They basically they open up like the windows, the sides of their brewery, and just let yeast come in. Like, come in, here's all this, like, sugar water. Go nuts. And so I recommend trying some good sour beers. I go for, like, the mouth-puckering, delicious ones. One of my favorites, like a Cassé or a Solera aged. So Cassé, Cassee. It's going to be so sour. I mean, your mouth is going to salivate with one sip. It's both an experience and an enjoyable flavor.
And are we gonna drink it every day, or is it like once in a month or once in a year type of beer?
It can be pretty acidic. Honestly, I will go for once a week.
All right. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending your time. And I really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, thank you very much. This was a pleasure. Glad to be on.